Welcome to the fourth video of a 7-part series on magnetic workflows. In this series, I'm going to explain the different parts of workflows, how they fit together, and ultimately design and implement a simple workflow. By the end of this series, I hope that you'll have a better understanding of how this feature works and how to best use it to your company's advantage. In this video, I'm going to explain what conditions are and how you can use them to refine the scope of a workflow. I'll further dig into the concept of trigger variables and also bring up actor and system variables. I will finally talk about some of the things to keep in mind while using conditions. So what is a condition? A condition is a way to reduce the scope of a workflow. As discussed previously, a trigger is the broadest possible version of if this happens. But in most cases, you won't want your workflows to fire on every available trigger, and would rather they only fired under specific circumstances. Conditions allow you to only execute the workflow's actions if every condition is met. Conditions may be extremely simple. In a task close trigger, a simple condition might be the task's owner is Bob. Conditions may also be complicated. In the same trigger, a more complicated condition might be the time that the task closed is more than 5 days after the task's end date, and the user who closed the task is in the accounts department. Any number of conditions can be chained together on a workflow. All conditions must be satisfied before a workflow will continue executing. To set up a condition, you'll select the trigger, and once you've selected a trigger, you'll be able to add conditions by clicking the plus button next to Conditions. Clicking this will add a new row with 2 drop-down boxes, a bigger text box, a spanner button, and an X button. Clicking the X button will remove a condition. The first drop-down box is the field to compare in this condition. Expanding the box will show you all your available variables. Many of these are related to the trigger, and the trigger variables we discussed in the previous video. An example of this would be status. The next drop-down box represents the comparison being made. With text, you are able to compare with an exact match, a partial match, or even a non-match. With dates and numbers, you can compare exact matches as well as greater than or less than operators. I'm going to select starts with for the status. The final field is the conditional value. In this case, what if the value must the status start with in order for the condition to be satisfied? For this condition, I'm simply going to enter review. Now let's add a more complicated condition. Again, I'm going to click the plus icon to add another row. Let's say that I want to limit this workflow to only taking action if the person who did the action has been in the company for less than a month. How would I do this? To do this, we would use actor variables. Similar to trigger variables, actor variables represent data that is associated with a specific workflow execution. The actor in this case is the user who performed the action that started the workflow, not the person who created the workflow. If I close a task, I am the actor for any task close triggers that fire. If you close a task, you are an actor in that case. Actor variables let you access important information such as the triggering user's department, when their account was created, and their name. This permits your workflows to be context aware in terms of who it was that fired the trigger in the first place. Finally, we also have system variables. System variables are not affected by the trigger or the actor. For example, regardless of which trigger is fired or who fired it, today's date will be the same. The system variable list lets you access these kinds of constant values in your conditions and actions. Here's a simple diagram explaining how variables are fed to a workflow based on the trigger and the actor. Feel free to pause to read closer. Back to our example, I want to add a condition that the workflow will only execute if the person who closed the task, the actor, has been with the company for less than a month. First, I will select actor created date from the field dropdown. Then, I will want the actor created date to be greater than 1 month ago. As such, I will select greater than in the comparison dropdown. Here's where we have to get clever. I somehow have to tell this condition that the value it's comparing against is 1 month ago. Today is the 1st of the 1st, 2022. So I could just type that in -1 month. But in 1 month's time, that constant variable will be the same, and the workflow would be firing on users who are up to 2 months old. So that's not going to work. This is where the spanner button comes in handy. This spanner button opens up the variable panel, which lets us select variables, modify them, and insert them into our conditions and actions in the right format for Magnetic to understand them. Firstly, I'm going to select the system variable for today. This is a start, since it will always be the date that the trigger is fired. But we don't want to compare it against today. We want to compare it to 1 month ago. This is where modifiers come up. Modifiers permit me to do small, quick changes to variables. If we open the modifier dropdown, it shows us all our options. In this case, the modifier we want to use is go back num months, which shifts the variable as many months we want into the past. In this case, we just want to move it back 1 month. So I'll type in 1 and click Add Modifier. This staples the modifier onto the chosen variable. If you want to add multiple modifiers in a row, you can. If we wanted to move the date a month and a day backwards, we could add the appropriate modifier now and create a modifier chain to do what we want. For now, we're just going to reduce the date by 1 month. The final step on this inject panel is to click Inject. You'll notice that a complicated piece of text has been placed into this text box. Curly brackets are our way of telling Magnetic, hey, this is a variable, please process it properly. If you remove the curly braces yourself, you might end up with some weird results. When we switch to the locked view, we pick up those variable tags and display it a bit nicer. Now we have 2 conditions, that the closed task status starts with review, and that the person who closed it was created less than a month ago. If these 2 conditions are not satisfied, the workflow will do nothing else. As I hope you can see, conditions and variables provide a lot of flexibility to your workflow. However, with great flexibility comes great responsibility, and there are some ways that might trip you up if you're not careful. For example, if you add no conditions at all, the workflow will execute whenever the trigger is fired. There may be some cases in which you want to do this, but be careful. If you bind actions to a trigger that is fired often without conditions, you could find yourself using up a lot of compute time or performing actions more regularly than you want. We also have a bit of trouble detecting contradictory conditions when we are setting up a condition. It will not, for example, stop you from creating a condition task status is exactly equal to done and task status is exactly equal to in progress. This workflow will never be able to satisfy both its conditions, and as such, it will never actually fire off. Take some time to look at these general rules for conditions when thinking about how to build them into your workflows. This concludes the introductory video on conditions. The next video will explain actions and show you how to use them to get things done.